Welcome to Blue Grit Radio, the podcast that explores making better cops for a better community. I'm your host, Eric Tung. I've been an active police officer since 2007. We will dive into the aspects of police culture, health and wellness, leadership, and mindset. You'll hear from experts not only from policing, but all industries as they relate to being our best with purpose, passion, and positivity. Join me as we share stories, lessons, and advice so we can all be better for ourselves, our teams, our families, and our communities. All right, ladies and gentlemen, welcome back to another episode of Blue Grit Radio. This is your host, Eric, and I'm joined today by Luke Goodish. Luke, thanks for being on the show, man.
Yes, thank you for having me. I appreciate it.
Yeah, for sure. So I'm super stoked for this, and this is a different episode in that as we started talking after talking about coming on the show, I've come to learn a lot more about you and what you do, and that there's just so many crossovers to the audience and first responder work, but just people and individuals just living, not to sound a certain way, like their best life, but no, their most purposeful life, right? Their most valued life to serve others and be an integral part of the fabric of community. And for listeners, they're probably like, where is he even going? Like, what is he talking about? If you read the show notes, you'll know. But the reason why I reached out to Luke initially and we got connected was your Instagram, man. You know, you're an author, you write fiction, and you write about, heroes, you write about adventure. And I think that there's so much missing in our culture, not for those listening probably, because a lot of people listening are in a type of service work, right? Military veterans, they're first responders, they're people that genuinely care about the development of themselves and others. But for the rest of, society, when I think about the direction we're going that's not so positive, I think it is a lack of sense of agency. I think it's a lack of sense of life purpose and connectedness with others and telling a story and living a life worth reading about, all these notions. And so I knew it would be a fantastic conversation picking your brain about storytelling, and then come to learn that you work in the mental health space with narrative therapy. So before I keep rambling, Luke, if you could introduce yourself for the audience.
Yeah, I'm Luke. I'm a writer. I write men's adventure fiction, but I also, by trade and training, I'm a clinical mental health counselor. And I'm going to kind of go springboard off what you said. The biggest focus for me is helping mostly men, but men and women live purpose-driven lives. You said it perfectly. That's where we're seeing kind of a decay in mental health. When you see the charts of like depression skyrocketing, it's these addictions of meaninglessness and like these deaths of despair, because I just don't think people do have that sense of meaning, that sense of purpose. And when I write, I do try to write these more optimistic stories, these stories that bring out like the idealism and the old-fashioned heroicism, because that's what I think we need a little bit more of in our culture, a little bit more something to bring us back to showing us we can be more and we're here for more. My first tattoo I ever got was Saved for More, just because I needed to remind myself I was in a very dark place, suicidal in a younger time, and I needed to remind myself that I actually have purpose, I actually have a meaning. And it takes a lot of work. It takes a lot of discipline. I mean, look at yourself, your Instagram. Like, you just did burpees for what, a whole month or something like that? Like, it takes pushing yourself a bit further, and it is a little bit uncomfortable, but that's ultimately what builds a foundation of purpose. And that's kind of what I'm all about, is helping individuals see, okay, you are worth more and you can do more. You just have to put in a little bit more.
Yeah, I love that, man. And thank you for sharing a little bit of your story, your personal adversity. It is that courage that inspires others, right? To say, hey, I've been there. And I'm sure that lends largely into everything you're doing now, your primary job, your secondary job, your pursuits and your passions. So thank you for that, man. I'm curious if you could tell us a little bit about what led to that low, hard time for you and what helped pull you out of that.
For me, that was freshman year of like undergrad, coming right out of high school. And these transitionary periods are huge for people. Like, that's a really big time that if you see someone in a transition, moving out of the military, moving out of high school, like, just be on alert that's a tough time for people. And so I was coming out of high school, going into college, and I had built my identity and my story, right? Let's use that narrative through line. I built my narrative on a very shaky base. What a lot of high schoolers do, a relationship. Like, I built my identity on like who I was dating, and when that fell away, when that relationship crumbled, my shaky base, my foundation, it disintegrated. So I was just kind of free falling in this new world with new friends. And I started to, for the first time in my life, like I never smoked or drank. I started to like smoke marijuana, and I tried to like, I was skipping class. I just had no purpose. And I was just living hedonistically, moment by moment, just trying to like claw forward and find out what I was supposed to do. And I wasn't finding an answer really. I was just like, this is meaningless and I don't like how I feel. So that by winter of my freshman year, I was, like I was on the verge of taking my own life. And I was very convinced that that was probably the best option for me, because just looking forward, there wasn't anything. And that to me came from not looking up high enough or like forward enough. Because when you get depressed, when you're in that state, your focus is so narrowed, it's so tunnel visioned in, and I don't think people realize that. You're like a bug inside of a cup. This is not my analogy. This is from a book called Suicide. I forget the author, but you're a bug in a cup, and you just look everywhere you look is just wall, 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 wall. I can't get out of here, and you don't realize that above you is just complete freedom. Like you're back in the real world. It's fine. Um, so to me, I was just tunnel focused after losing my identity, trying to find happiness. And it was too much of a hedonistic pursuit, too much of a pursuit of like what feels good. And it wasn't until kind of understanding extreme ownership or like discipline and kind of pay now, pay later concepts of, okay, this might suck now. It might not feel super good now, but there are actually things down the road that can be better and brighter in my future if I put my nose to the grindstone. So in a nutshell, that was that arc for me in the freshman year of college.
No, there's a lot to unpack there, and I think it's helpful. At least I would like to reflect on my limited scope of depression, especially earlier in my life, right? I've had
Mhm.
people in my closest circles extremely depressed, and I was so naive to how to even help them, right? And I cringe at thinking and recalling, and I'm not going to share, this notion of telling people just to like pick themselves up, just
Right.
just do it, right? Just stop, right? Like, how ignorant does that sound? And for those hearing that are like, man, I don't even know what to do beyond that, stay tuned. We're going to talk about it. And it's still something that I'm learning about. But if I reflect accurately on some of my experiences, I would say that I've definitely been in depressed states. This is not to say, look at me. This is not to say like, no, I wasn't clinically diagnosed, but when I reflect back, like I was not clear headed. I was not able to focus on all the good things around me or all the good potential or all the good things in my life. And that's because it's hormonal. It's like literally your brain chemistry and like affecting
Right.
your mood and everything, like literally your motivation, and you're just not thinking clearly. And so I'm wondering if you could share, especially from your professional background, what kind of tips would generally help people, and then what people can do, especially in these notions of peer support or buddy checks, to help people navigate through that.
Yeah, the big thing that I kind of like to point out to people with depression and that feeling in general, like like you said, it might not be clinically considered depression, but when you're feeling that type of way where you're down and you're not yourself, sleep and like diet and exercise, those things need to be in check first before you think anything else. Like those three pillars are what my counselor talked to me about first when I showed up. Are you getting enough sleep? Are you eating well? And are you getting exercise? Without those, it's going to be really hard no matter what kind of talk therapy, no matter what kind of buddies you have, really hard to work against that uphill battle of physiology and that side of mental health. So first thing is getting those things in check. And then, like you said, you can't say and kind of put an answer. There's no definitive, easy, quick answer of like, hey, do this and you will feel better. Why don't you just try a little bit harder today? Why don't you just be positive today? That stuff, it feels like it would help, but it just doesn't do much in the long run. What you need to do is just be there. A lot of the time, it's nothing you're going to say to a friend is going to help. It's just simply showing them that you show up and that you're there and that you can listen, which, can be tough, especially as guys. I just find this with my wife all the time. I want to give a solution. I'm like, this makes sense. Let's just do this. But it's like they just want
Yeah.
the listening side of things. They want to just be heard rather than fixed. And same things with mental health. Your friend, he might want to be fixed, and you might want to be fixed, but it doesn't work like that. It's like a tangle. Think of a tangle of knots in your head, like a big rope all tangled up. It takes time to kind of work that loose and kind of get those knots out and straighten that line back out so you can feel level headed again. When it's all crumbled up and you're just pulling at it, you're just going to tighten those knots. You have to give them time, give them space, and realize that they might not even be ready. That was the hardest lesson for me. It's like, this person needs to be in counseling. This person needs help, and being, so frustrated that they wouldn't go into counseling. And I would talk to my counselor about it. And he said, maybe they're not ready, right? You can't force them to be where you're at. You have to meet them where they are.
Yeah.
So those are some things hopefully you find helpful.
Those are super helpful. I think you just packaged it up so well, right? To say, hey, when someone's in a point of crisis or a point of need, just showing up. And it's become a tagline in a lot of ways. And I think that those that really try to develop themselves or think through it, okay, if I'm with someone and they are in a point of depression or suicidal ideation, what do I say? And it doesn't matter usually, right? It
Yeah.
is true when people keep saying just show up or just say something, right? Just say, hey, I'm here. And you don't have to overthink it. You can be transparent and honest because that people feel that they resonate with that, where you're just like, hey, I don't know what to say, but I care about you and I'm here. And whatever it looks like down the road, I don't know what that looks like, but I'm here with you. That's so huge, right? And we can all reflect
It's-
on that in a time that we were super stressed, anxious, depressed, what have you. And yeah, just knowing that someone is there is huge.
And it takes a lot of pressure off the person who's trying to help too, to realize that you aren't going to have the answers. So don't think that, because I think with myself in the past, I've kind of been there less than I should have for certain people, because I didn't know what to say. And I was like, okay, how do I got to think of the perfect thing to say. I have to really rack my brain, think of what I should do. And I spent so much time not talking or communicating or being there with them because I'm so in my head about showing up correctly.
Hmm.
But there is no, don't put that pressure on yourself. Just, as you put it, be as authentic as you possibly can. If that means saying, hey, I feel like completely out of my element, I feel like a complete idiot, I don't know what to say to you, but I just want you to know I'm here. If that's all you got, that's what matters most, because it's what's real and raw, and you're there most.
Yeah, for sure. And I want to refocus back in on a point you made about transition periods and how we
Mhm.
can look out for each other and we can look out for ourselves, right? So, for a lot of the audience, a natural point that we frequently talk about, or I frequently talk about, or even write about, is the new officer, right? Because you're adopting this totally different lifestyle and environment. You're looking at this other angle and this extreme concentrated exposure of the human condition, which oftentimes is, people doing terrible things at their worst moment or experiencing terrible things at their worst moment. So that's one thing to be really sensitive to, is helping people navigate through that culture shock, if you would. But you also talked about relational conversation and communication with your wife, and I've been there, right? I think a lot of
Mhm.
guys could resonate with that. And yeah, it's not just to stay with guys, it's all relationships, but I'll say guys because you and I, that's what we know, right? That's the experience in life we know. And when you mentioned that, it popped up this very clear time when one huge transition point was me becoming a dad. And being a dad is one of the only things I really know through just about all my life I knew I wanted to be. Like, I didn't think I wanted to be a cop through a significant portion of my life until early adulthood in college. But a dad was something I always wanted. And just to reflect on that, like, there was a point where I was super emotional, and there were points I was super emotional through in all the ways, super lovey dovey, like,
Yeah.
I was already kind of, tear bound at a Pixar, ending, kind of Disney ending kind of vibe. But yeah, after having a daughter, like, yeah, over the top, like, fight back those tears. And I'm
Yeah.
not apologetic about it.
I'm with you.
Yeah, but on the other angle, it's like, and we can come back to that, right? Talking about, sensitive men and these notions of like toxic masculinity. And I know we talked about that before, but also on the other angle, like, I was irritable, right? And I'd feel really low and unmotivated at times. Like, I look back at like my old Instagram before Blue Grit, and, I would post workout videos with my daughter in a front pack, like doing lunges and,
Mhm.
doing squats. And like, that was great at times, but also there was the opposite where I was so exhausted and so sleep deprived because she was like borderline colicky and we were
Yeah.
up so much, and I was working nights when I went back to work. And yeah, I just remember like sleep was garbage and then nutrition was garbage. I was just like exhausted, stress eating, like just standing at the counter, just rocking her, trying to soothe her. And then I would just be like crushing a bag of, whatever, right? Like snacks, nuts, dried
Mhm.
fruit, and just feeling like garbage. And then so those things are all so intertwined. And I tell that story mostly because I want people to feel okay about that, right? Again, it's not like a look at me, but hey, I've been there. And so if you find yourself in a place, like, give yourself grace and then recognize what Luke's talking about, right? This is a extreme transition point where your life is kind of thrown upside down in amazing ways and just also kind of significant ways, and just give yourself time and space. And if you can muster up the energy to reflect, talk with your people, talk with your partner, and just work through it very slowly, very surely.
Yeah, I'm gonna add to that too with kind of this report card analogy I heard before, where in that situation, right, and what you were saying resonated so much. I have two under two. My daughter's just
Mm,
turned like 2 months, so I'm in that period where I'm just not
congrats.
getting sleep. She, thank you,
Oh man.
but
Yeah,
I feel that
congrats.
where
You
it's
don't
like
sleep.
my sleep, my diet, everything's falling apart, and it's like I think again when we go back to what we said about depression being too hyper focused, too limited in how it sees, look at yourself in the totality of things. Look at yourself from 30,000 feet up and look at your life like a report card real quick and say, okay, as a dad, you're A plus right now because you are spending so much time caring for this baby and keeping them alive and like soothing them. So A plus for dad. Fitness, maybe it's at a B, work drops to a C, whatever. You
Mm,
need to look at the whole grand scheme and realize that sometimes in those transitional periods, you will have to dip down and let some go. For me, that was when like I first had my kid, I realized my writing slowed down and I would just get so hard on myself until that reframe of, okay, this is a wild transition in my life. I've never learned to write with a child and then now two kids. It's like how you can't hold yourself to such a high standard at all times. You need to realize, okay, I need to back off the gas here so that I can press here because this matters. This needs my priority. I can't just abandon my kid because I want to write. You know what I mean? You have
mm-hmm.
to pick and choose. And so looking at that and realizing that sometimes you're gonna be below where you want to at certain times in certain areas of your life, and that's all right. Give yourself grace, as you said, and keep moving forward. And that time period will smooth back out. You'll get a different report, and you'll be back where you want to be.
Yeah, I like that too because I reflected a similar notion where I frequently get hard on myself on what I'm accomplishing or what I'm not accomplishing. And sometimes that Facebook memory is hard, right? Like it pops up, 4 years ago, 8 years ago, and fitness has become a big thing for me in my adulthood. And to look at a picture of how lean I was or and then reflect on how strong I was back then, like literal ability to move weight. I'm like, man, that I was in my prime,
Yeah,
and then it's like glory days. And I'm like, no, I hate the notion of glory days. So I'm like, no, today is always a glory days, but it's hard to fight that, right? It's hard to convince yourself of that. But when I let it sit for a little bit, I'm like, man, that was before I had kids, right? Like I'm doing the best I can right now. And not to say I can't do better, but compare myself to today when I'm working tomorrow, or when I'm grinding it out today, compare myself to yesterday or last week, not 4 6 years ago. Like that's not freaking fair. It's not the
right.
same. It's
Becomes
not
a
apples to apples. Yeah.
yeah, it becomes like a just a non-issue there. You can't compare the
Yeah.
two. It's apples to oranges, like you said. It's
Yeah,
not
it's a
there.
different person, like literally, like, and it should be a different person. Like life experiences, insights, wisdoms, wear and tear on your body. Like, no, you're not. You're literally not the same. You can't just be, Dwayne Johnson, like looking like basically the same or better every
Right.
year. I don't know what some magic potions there or
Yeah,
whatever,
Hollywood actors,
but
right? Those guys
yeah,
get into super shape, but that's another thing you got to keep in mind. There's going to have an off period. Zac Efron doesn't look like he does in Iron Claw year round. He's going to
mm,
look
yeah,
different. So,
yeah,
and Instagram in general is like that. You got to remember that you're looking at people's highlights all the time,
mm-hmm,
and
yep,
not just the everyday worst of them, which you have to deal with your everyday worst. Like you see
mm-hmm.
everything. So, keeping all that in perspective.
No, that's so true. And like I'll just self admit right now, yeah, I'm one of them, right? Like if it's a video and I stuttered 18 times, then that video is going in the garbage, right? And
Yeah.
I'm gonna re-record that thing and I'm gonna curate and I'm gonna look at the 5 photos I have and pick the one I like the most, that has the best angle, right? Like it's not an authentic view. And I know that there's a lot of content and discussion on the ills of social media. So, yeah, to bring it back on that, like that's why I like what you're putting out, right? Even though you're curating it, it is these positive themes, and there's so much that I love about the archetypical, heroes or the stories that we look at. I think everyone, regardless of the flavor of the genre, there are these altruistic people in fiction, and a lot of them are based on history or aspects therein, where we look to that as an example of how to live better or be better or show value better and be of service better. So yeah, I kind of want to talk about that and what brought you into writing about these notions and themes.
I think really my writing all started back when I was around, I'd say third-ish grade, where I saw Rocky and
Mm,
just like how I could watch a story and then feel motivation in my body to want to go work out, like feeling that a story did something to me and changed how I wanted to live. And then I became a boxer through that. Like I started boxing because of that movie. It was
mm.
just that kind of relationship with the power of narrative that got under my skin. And from that point, I always wanted to write. And so
How much
I,
of that was because did it resonate with you more because you're in Pennsylvania, or were you there
yeah,
at the time?
probably. I mean, yeah, I'd always been in Pennsylvania. So I'm in more Pittsburgh area. That's Philadelphia, but
Yeah, yeah,
still, I mean, that definitely might have had something to do with it.
yeah.
I don't know what, like, because seriously, at the beginning of my life, I had no connection with boxing, but after that, like, I've been in love with boxing since then. So I don't know what about that movie did it for me,
I
but
mean, it's the underdog story, right? For some
yeah.
people, it's Rocky. Some people, it's Rudy. The
Hmm.
guy, the downtrodden. And what I love about Rocky that I really come to appreciate in my adulthood is just his humility, right? He's just a guy, and he never. You talk about three, which is probably the weak one, right? Where he gets dissuaded by materialism, but there's some good lessons there too. But
Yeah,
otherwise, he's just a simple dude, just trying to do his thing, just trying to be with his love and be the best he can be and prove the doubters wrong. Like, what's not to love about that?
right. Yeah, he's just so wholesome, doesn't have any grudges. I love like the interview scenes, right, where they're doing the press conference, they're trying to get him to say something mean, and
Hmm.
he can't. But yeah, I think just that relationship with the narrative, realizing its power, made me think about that throughout my life. And as I wrote, because I started writing at third grade, nothing was good, obviously, and didn't put anything out until later. But I
It's
would,
probably good for a third grader, though, right?
hopefully, I mean, I would not show it to you to find out, but we can just say that. To me, I wanted to look at how stories impact our lives. And as I got into counseling and like schooling for that, realizing that there was a whole branch of counseling surrounding this. Like narrative therapy is a thing, which is based off the idea that these stories we tell ourselves matter and they are what kind of lead to our behaviors and our actions and have such an influence over us. That was eye opening to me. And same with like the archetypes you mentioned. Carl Jung talks about the archetypes and how there are these certain figures and archetypes in our history that have just been there and have always been there and will always be there that we resonate with. And if you look at someone like Joseph Campbell, you find out that all stories follow an archetype. It is
Yeah.
the hero's journey. And it's like, wow, this stuff all became very interesting to me. And pair that with kind of the world I'm living in and seeing what everyone else is seeing with toxic masculinity. These narratives are like defund the police narratives, seeing people kind of turn their back on some of the more masculine aspects or characteristics of individuals. That made me think, you know, about writing positive versions of that, to kind of show people where my point of view was, where I was
Hmm.
coming from. Because it's like I'm not great at debating. That's not where I am. I don't want to sit there and debate somebody on that, but I can write a story where hopefully you see my point of view of like, do you see how this philosophy makes sense in this guy's life and how it turned out for like a positive end?
Hmm.
And so that's kind of where, if that, hopefully that answers your question, but that's kind of where
Yeah.
that came from, is just trying to use the power of narrative to showcase what I think is valuable that I think is slipping away from our culture.
Yeah. I think it's huge. And it's something I talk frequently about. And I use probably a different term most of the time, which is to reframe, right? Like look at the narrative. We're frequently used to hearing the narrative of the mainstream media or the narrative of um, for my audience, anti-police rhetoric, right? And
Mhm.
so too often we need to be aware of it, so it's in the context, but too often we make all of our decisions based on it and we start to adopt it in a way, right? And so in the example of that, police felt, and oftentimes I heard it verbalized so many times, the public doesn't want us. The public doesn't want us to enforce the law. The public doesn't want us to arrest on drugs. It's like, well, we've literally said that. We made this gross generalization because now we're seeing more and more vocally. I mean, there were vocal people before, but now more and more people are fed up, and their communities are ravaged by that sense, right? And by empowering that negative narrative, we've adopted it and we've taken it on, and we feel dejected and we feel a loss of purpose. We feel a loss of, I suppose, value and ability to affect the things that we signed up for. And that there's an angle of moral injury in there, as far as like not doing the things that you feel like you ought to do to help, and also feeling conflicted therein. Yeah. So I think there's so much to that, when you think about the power of narrative or the story. Whereas a lot of really resilient officers or really resilient folks, they hear it, they mind it, and they're like, yeah, I'm going to prove that wrong, right? So going back to your Rudy or Rocky stories, right? Like, hey, people say all cops are, blank, or everyone's just part of this, terrible institutionalization. Well, I'm going to be about it. And there's people that sign up because they want to be about it and they want to demonstrate the type of officer that they think they need to be and they think that people need to see. And then they join the ranks that way, right? So I think that it's extremely powerful in all that.
And you posted something, I think it was just yesterday, about how we create culture daily.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that is a thematic that is in my first couple of novels. Is like the idea of momentum and culture building. And yeah, you can have a bad actor or like somebody who does not have values, and they can kind of be in a leadership position, and that can trickle down. But it doesn't mean that people below him, like, you don't have to be in a leadership position to stand up and hold your own values and kind of bring that culture back up. So that's something that I really played with in those first two novels, is meeting the audience where they're at, thinking like, oh, this is just another representation of like corrupt police and racist cops. And you realize that the cops are actually the self-sacrificing heroes. And it takes just a culture shift. It takes individuals who take individual responsibility and stand up on their own to do something. That's what matters. It's like, it comes down to the person and the values that they're going to espouse. And you have the personal choice to hold the line if you choose, and to stand up if you choose. But being that hero and changing the culture like that, it's gonna be tough. It's not gonna be easy to stand up against momentum.
Yeah, and so when we talk about adventure novels and fiction, like I think back to so many stories that resonated with me as a kid, and I loved the underdog stories, right? And there's so many, talking about Disney Pixar, they're really good at it, right? Crafting story in this,
Hmm.
but there is that it's the same story in a lot of ways, right?
Right.
Lion King is Hamlet, and shoot, you could probably rattle off more direct comparisons than I can as far as like literature. But with the hero's journey, I'm curious if you could talk a little bit about that, because I think that there's probably listeners that aren't super familiar. They might be like, yeah, that sounds familiar, but I think that it could be impactful to tie a lot of this together.
I think one of the most important aspects of the hero's journey is that first thing, which is the call to action or the call to adventure. Because I think this is where, this is just my ramblings. This is no theory, but like, this is where I
I
think
love it. Let's go
a
there. Yeah.
lot, a lot of the culture and like feeling of meaninglessness comes from, is we hear this distinct call to adventure, this call to action. We hear some rumbling somewhere in our heart. We know we want to do something, but there's a disconnect. We don't know how to like listen to that or accept that journey a lot of the time, because of a very simple reason. It's the fact that we're like addicted to our phones and we're just sitting scrolling all day, and we're not pursuing this thing. So the hero's journey is about finding your call to action, stepping up, and it really takes you, there's different versions of the journey, but it's going to take you past what's called like the point of no return, and you're going to drop into a world that is difficult and full of trials and um, heartbreak, and it's going to be miserable. Like, the hero's journey is not an easy one. It's a
Mm.
hard task of toil and torment, and you come back through on the other side having learned lessons that you needed to kind of return to the world. And now the world's different somehow, because either it's changed or you've changed. That's kind of, in a nutshell, what happens. Is you feel that adventure, or you feel the call, you go, you take the adventure. It's tough, you learn something, and now there's change. And that's just a cycle that we run through in our lives. But I think a lot of people are stuck feeling like, "Ugh, I feel like I'm meant for more. I feel like I need to do something." They feel that restlessness, that general, like, just lack of content. I think it's because we're not actually stepping forward past that point of no return. We're not actually stepping into the fold. We're not walking down the path of the hero's journey. We're staying content. We're staying complacent. We're staying within that murmuring river of momentum, where we're just sitting there. And that does not how, I don't think, humans were meant to be. I think we were meant to do more. I think we were meant to like adventure and push ourselves and go out there and explore. So that's just my theory on that.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, we think about these stories that, might have changed our lives and how we impact or how we view the world and how we view purpose. Saving Private Ryan is one for me, one of my favorite all-time movies, top 10,
Yeah.
maybe top 5 or top 3, right? And when I think about it, I think of themes of sacrifice. I think of themes of brotherhood, and I think of these things that I wanted to be integrated into through my whole life, part of which I didn't even know it, right? Like I was always yearning for that, kind of fraternal bond with a group of people doing something really important. And in hindsight, it makes sense that I became a cop, but growing up, I was just, kind of looking for that belonging of something greater. I think most people, when they're honest with themselves, recognize that adversity and that turmoil or that hardship is where they grow, or they have the ability to grow, right? We know that there's victimhood, which would allow people to crumble and just stay in that low point, or they have the adversity, whether it's moving weight at the gym to tear your muscles so that they can rebuild and you can be stronger, or it's that hard time, in school or a new job where you don't know anybody and all your support networks are essentially severed and you have to rebuild them, what have you, whatever aspect of adversity. I love the socializing idea of get comfortable being uncomfortable, right? Dive in, right? Seek that discomfort. But I also kind of want to flip it where I want people to start getting uncomfortable with the comfortable, right? So if I'm just in my little bubble and I got my Netflix, I got my phone, I got my Uber Eats, and everything is coming to me in this easy way, I want people to get restless. I feel like we should have this innate, and maybe that's what you're talking about. Maybe there is that thing that
Yeah.
people are kind of fighting back or contending with, but that should feel terrible. Like you should kind of want to scream and run outside and, just start breathing in the cold air and just, let your
Yeah.
hair kind of go wild a little bit, like just to shake that off. What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, it's something that I feel like I feel that see myself in this 70-degree environment. I've got like my food that was just ordered and delivered, and I'm watching like Legends of the Fall or something, and I'm seeing just guys living off the land, and I'm just like, this is what am I doing? This is
Yeah.
I'm wasting my potential. I'm wasting what I could be doing. I think that is something that's important, and it can be overdone. I've overdone it. My counselor said I have like a human doing problem, meaning
Mm.
that I'm good at being a human doing stuff, not really good at being a human being, just sitting and doing nothing.
Oh,
And I
yeah.
have that restless spirit.
Yeah.
And that can, that can turn into being a workaholic. That is something to look at. But I think for the majority of people, it's okay to push yourself a little bit further than you are. It's okay to say, wow, I'm being lazy, and just kind of call yourself out. I think the man in the mirror concept that we can take back to Rocky, where he's so many scenes in so many movies, people are just dramatically looking at mirrors. But I think there's a lesson in that where it's like the only person you can't really lie to is yourself. You can try, you'll say so many things, whether it's the victim card or I have like a heart condition, I might just use that and be like, well, I can't because of that. You can put whatever you want as an excuse not to do it, but something in you is going to keep stirring and keep saying, nope, I don't feel right about this. And you're going to have that gnaw at you. And that's, again, going to your call to adventure. That's what I think that is. It's the call to action. We have an adventure that we're meant to live. If you just sit there and waste it, you're going to feel terrible.
Yeah, absolutely. Side note, I want to give a little props and recognition when you said your counselor, right? I recently talked to a therapist and she works largely with first responders, but I was like, hey, like, I know this from peer support interactions and doing stress debriefs, but I know that's heavy. Like there's been times where I was desperately trying to find someone else kind of unpack a critical incident, right? Something involving a child. Like I wanted to provide that care to the
Mhm.
officers involved, but I was just in a place where I was like, this is not going to be good for me. And luckily, someone was able to take their turn in the bucket for me. And I was so appreciative. But just to recognize that secondary, tertiary trauma can be so heavy. And with you working in mental health, I appreciate that very casually. Yeah, when I talked to my counselor, because that therapist, when I asked, hey, like, who do you talk to or what's your practice? She's like, oh, I got a person. And
Yeah.
she kind of said, like, if there's a therapist that doesn't have, or, MHP, a counselor, psychologist that doesn't have somebody, like, that's a red flag. There should be someone unpacking something. So I just want to say thank you for your service, in this mental health, certainly epidemic that we're facing as a society, and helping everyone navigate through that and having these conversations that go into so many more things than just how do we curb this thing, but no, how do we live with purpose? How do we be more positive and depict and highlight these examples and values to best showcase that?
Well, I appreciate you. Thank you for saying that. But I think that that is kind of the thing. It's not just living content or being okay. Showing people that they actually are capable of a lot more. I think that's something that's really important. Is for counseling, and like what I do is I'm not just trying to get people to survive and like make it. I want people to have good lives where they feel like really good about things and that they really matter and that they really can do a lot more. And that's my goal is always to just help people realize that they can do so much more and be so much more.
Yeah, I hear that, and I think empowerment, right? Like people ought to be empowered to achieve greatness in whatever way that is for them, right? It's not to be like the best, most successful, most famous, whatever, right? No, it's like, but there's so many things. Like if you want to be a creator, if you want to be an artist, if you want to be a father, if you want to be just a devoted community member, like there, yes, you have that. You can do that. And through the power of story, like you see, some of our favorite stories are when it really looks like the chips are down and there's nothing that is going to help this person get to where they want to go or need to go except for their own will and their own grit and their own day-to-day grind and overcoming the odds. We know it's possible, right? We know people in our lives that do it, and if we're honest with ourselves, there's probably times that we've done it. So no, I love that. And I'm curious, I want to ask you something, but first, could you tell us a little bit more about your heart condition, right? We talked about that a little bit as far as like the medical, physical adversity that you faced.
Yeah, so probably not going to get the medical names right, and I don't want to sit here and try to recall what they are. But
Totally
essentially, they made
fine. Yeah,
my
I wouldn't understand anyway. So be like, yeah, the heart thing was doing this thing where,
right, and they made my like 4-chamber heart work as a 2-chamber heart, essentially. Like two
hmm,
chambers are just not functioning in my heart, and so that took 2 open heart surgeries. One when I was 4 months old, one when I was 4 years old. And so those both have names. I'm just forgetting them right now. Maybe a Fontaine shunt and a Glenn shunt are involved. That's as far as I'm going to get you medically.
mhm.
All I know is I worked as a 2-chamber heart, and there's a big backup in my liver because this year the big news was that I developed cirrhosis in my liver, as if I was like
Jeez.
a raging alcoholic because my heart's like dumping bile into my liver. So that's my heart condition, and used to be not like I wasn't allowed to play sports until around 7th grade, I'd say. And then I played sports, and then I immediately wanted to box and things like that. So I was wrestling, I was boxing, and that was fine until I moved to Arizona for a brief period of time, around 22 years old, let's say 23, something like that. And I got clots in my heart, lung, and legs, and they switched me off the baby aspirin I was on and put me on like an old man blood thinner, like
Wow.
Eliquis twice a day. So um, sports kind of had to stop there. I wasn't allowed to box anymore. Like I still hit the bag and stuff, but I'm not allowed to like box and get hit and stuff anymore.
Hmm.
Yeah, so that's kind of how I've been living with it since then. It's just Eliquis twice a day, and it's slowly killing my liver. And so like there's things to contend with, and that's why I go to counseling. That's why I do study like existentialism is one of my favorite forms of therapy because there's those 4 givens in life that we all have: death, meaninglessness, isolation, and freedom. And so everyone has that. So just because I have a heart condition doesn't really change anything. You and I are still going through somewhat of the same thing. You're gonna die. I'm gonna die. I just happen to know how I'm gonna die. Like it's just that's how I see my heart condition.
Man, well, thank you for sharing that, especially as you're going through it. So it sounds like you had issues with your heart from childhood that your family and you were aware of.
Yeah. So they like found out when I was in like the womb still. Like when I was there, they told my parents basically like it's not gonna happen. Get your affairs in order and let's just end this pregnancy. My parents didn't want to do that, so they kept like
Wow.
looking around until they found one guy who was like, "Let's try it." You know what I mean? And so he agreed to do the surgeries, and they worked out, and I'm still here. So it worked.
Man, so to unpack a little bit of that, from my purview, you have you're an underdog from the beginning, right? Where
Yeah.
some medical professionals would say, "Hey, this child's not viable," which is super sad and happens in other cases. But it's like, no, your parents like refuse to say no, and on your behalf, and you in there refuse to say no. Your body refused to say no, right? And here you are today. You're helping others. You're a family man. You're doing the thing. You're creating positive narratives and story. We don't know what's next, what the next chapter is, but I hear you, very positively saying, yeah, I'm like I'm working through it and it's part of the thing. And there's just so much to be admiring about that, right? There's so much inspiration that I'm drawing from learning about your story today. What helps you keep a clear mind? You talked about learning and focusing on existentialism, but is there anything in there specifically that's been helpful?
Yeah, I think so. For me, a personal one that's not going to relate to everybody that we won't. I don't have to I won't preach. Is I'm Christian, so that helps me. Other than that, for anybody, I think coming to terms with the fact that there are certain givens that you cannot fight against, you cannot refute. Like that kind of concept is one that can be really challenging. So like spending time getting over that hurdle of this is not going to change, and I just have to learn how to figure a way around, like how I have to live with it. That is where most of my, I guess, mental gymnastics comes in. Like where what I'm doing is realizing I can't move this thing out of my way, so I have to live with it there and kind of set up around it and set up camp within this reality. So for people, depending on what you're going through, it's going to be personal to you, but just realizing that the situation you're in is still very lucky. Like being grateful. I wake up every morning and I'm saying thank you for another day where I'm breathing, and I go to bed
Hmm.
saying the same thing. I'm like, thank you for another day where I'm breathing. Like I'm actually alive today. I could actually do things. That's huge. Like you don't realize how much you do have until you start to take stock. And if like somebody wants a pragmatic takeaway, do this. Sit down with a pen and paper and just start writing out everything that you could be grateful for, and go set a timer for 20 minutes, because if you're listening to this, you have 20 minutes worth of things to be thankful for. You have heat, and you have food, and you have family, you have friends. There's so much. Like my heart beating for me is another one. It's like, oh, I woke up this morning, I'm not dead, let's go. So just finding everything you're grateful for and listing that out can be such a benefit. So I hope that's a pragmatic takeaway for people, to sit there and do that.
Yeah, it is for me. And I've dabbled with journaling, and recently I've had Joey, the 9 millimeter Musashi, on, and he was a huge proponent of journaling at the end of his day, and he was talking about how he does it with a fountain pen. I was like, okay, get the heck out of here. And he sent me a fountain pen, and so like my
Awesome.
own ownership is like, okay, I'm gonna do it. Like Joey, a gracious gift, and so I've been dabbling in that. And there is something about having to write, like hand write, and you have to slow down, you have to ponder, you have to think and kind of decompress that. But yeah, so much. And I'm actually glad you brought up faith, because it ties directly in with purpose. And faith can be a sticky point for people, because faith, religion, but no, I mean like faith in something, right? Faith in
Yeah.
something bigger. And you could call it spiritualism. And a lot of people get kind of nervous about that term too. But if not for belief in something, then what is it all for? And that doesn't have to be a greater power, if you put, quotes on that, or a god, but it could be the coexistence of people and like community, these notions of good and bad, good and evil. And we could go down huge rabbit holes there. But, I say that all to say, through most of my childhood, I was very agnostic or like atheist, and kind of came back. And now I don't know. I don't know if I could put a label on it, but so much of me in reflection recognizes that I do believe in good. I do believe in the positivity of humanity and supporting each other, and that it has to be for something, right? I believe in legacy. And so I do think that there's powers at play that I could never hope to understand in the universe and the cosmos, and that, my puny human brain just can't.
Yeah.
Um, and there's people that have devoted their whole lifetimes to trying to understand and conceptualize this and share this with others. So I just try to take little dabbles of that. Yeah, so much of what you said, I appreciate it, especially because I recognize when I had a near death experience and I just came back so high on life, right? Like I was in a shooting and I was almost blown up, and fire, I had second-degree burns on my arm, and I came out of that, as I would say, like relatively unscathed.
Yeah.
And talking about the power of narrative, like I've told this story before, but there was one time when my now wife was changing out my bandage, right? Because it was kind of awkward to do it on my own arm,
Mm.
and she was basically wrapping up, from wrist to shoulder. And she just was changing out the gauze, and then she just started sobbing. And she's like, every day you're gonna have these gnarly scars probably, and it's gonna remind me of the time that I almost lost you. It was almost like, I like to say this is like a movie moment, because
Yeah.
without skipping a beat, I was like, no, this is a reminder of how many days like I was regifted, right? How much time is a gift, and how grateful that we have for all this time. Not focus on almost losing me, but focus on how you didn't, or how we
Yeah.
didn't, and how we have this life. And it helped me live, a little bit braver in a lot of different ways. Not like putting myself in danger over and over, but like just in the fact that I felt like I had all this bonus time, because I recognized like it could have been a very different outcome that day. And everything that I kind of wanted to do, but I'd been dragging my feet, getting
Yeah.
married to my wife was one of them. Like there's no doubt in my mind for years that she was the one that I wanted to do life with, and I wanted to commit. But my practical, slow, kind of methodical brain was like, yeah, in time, like we'll get engaged and do this thing. But I was like, in those days, I was like, if there was one thing, if it was a poof of smoke and I'm up, upstairs or whatever, the afterlife, and I was looking down or looking around, and I felt deep regret, it was that I didn't show her and demonstrate how much I care, how much I love her, by giving her a ring, right?
Yeah.
If nothing else. So in that reflection, I was like, I know what I need to do. Just to say, like, that's one thing you can do in life, but how instrumental that hardship, right? That adversity was to help me catapult into this really positive space, right? I know not near death experiences and traumas can affect people in so many different ways. I feel so fortunate and grateful that I went that direction. Whereas I
Right.
know people in a very similar situation that went a very different direction, had a lot to unpack and work through, because it was scarring, like mentally scarring, to be in that kind of close encounter. I just feel so fortunate. I don't know why I didn't really go that way, but not to say it was easy.
Yeah.
I was looking for, and I'm gonna like kind of ramble a little bit because I want first responders to hear this, and I've said it at different places, but if this is the only place you hear it, like I was looking for these categorical trigger points, pun intended, I suppose, but I was looking for like these little areas that are typical, right? So I went back to the scene. There's a propane tank that exploded. I, lit up the barbecue on my, kind of healing time off, and I remember yelling into my now wife, like, "Hey, I'm gonna light up the barbecue if I start screaming or something. Just like come get me." And
Yeah.
like I might be having like a an episode. Getting reintroduced to firearms and taking my canine, to fire blanks with, and like none of those were like quote unquote triggers. Going back to work wasn't a trigger. Getting back in uniform wasn't a trigger. So I kind of thought it was fine. But in hindsight, I recognize that there are so many things that were just kind of the conglomerate of stress, where every time I redeployed my canine, we're looking for someone, like it's safe to be vigilant in my job, but I was like shooting way up with like at any moment someone's going to pop out and like ambush us. And so I just share that to say, hey, a lot of times it might not be that iconic textbook type of trigger, but it could be in a different way, right? It could pop its head up at home, something like that. I also want to just throw out, it for a long time that carried me through this really positive notion and really optimistic nature. I was like, but, as I've shared, little things through life, I felt low, and so I even had this, and I'm going to cringe saying it, but I had this notion at times where I was like, man, I need another one. Like it was like a dose. Like I was like, I'm in a not super motivated, not super positive state. I need another brush with death, to remind me, because I remember what that felt like. It felt like a drug. It felt like I was invincible in a way, and I was so
Right.
grateful, and I was craving that gratitude and that positivity. But as soon as I thought that, I was like, man, that's not good. That's not healthy, right? I don't need.
Yeah. It's
I
very
sh-
human, though, right?
yeah,
Very
yeah. And
human.
so I know that's a common thing that people chase in smaller ways to feel alive, like that adrenaline rush. And I was
Hmm.
never an adrenaline junkie, but it helps make sense for my brain, as to why people might seek risky behavior, kind of thrill-seeking things. Curious what your thoughts on. I knew I threw a lot at you, in the audience, but curious what your thoughts are on that.
So I think one thing that really stuck out, and I forget exactly where the touch point was. You kind of, I think it was around the time you were talking about that motivated you to go off and marry your wife and make that decision that you knew you wanted to make. Same thing happened when I first had the clots in my heart, lung, and legs. It was like, oh, I'd wanted to be a writer this entire time. and I just wrote and didn't do much with it. But then after that, it was like, okay, I should probably start moving. And like that was actually what pushed me down the path. And so I think for people, you don't have to have a near death experience to have this insight. This is what, thankfully you're doing a podcast like this and talking about these things. It can just be a reminder that I think solving the problem of death is solving the problem of time, and that people need to focus on how they're spending their day. Like when you just get things down to their most pragmatic, I tell a lot of people to do this, and that is just take a time audit sometimes where you're live your life how you do. Don't try to change anything because you're taking note on how you spend your day, but just live your life for a week and keep a pen and paper near you and write down what you're doing from time to time so that you can match what you're living like to your ideals in the life you wanted to live, and see where the discrepancies are. See how much time you're wasting. See how much or where you veer off from being the type of guy you want to be. I think that's something that's really important to do if you're feeling like something's not right in your life. It's just taking stock of how you're spending your time, because that's the only thing we're promised is that this road ends. And so you have to figure out how you're going to spend your time, because this is what we get. Like this is your stretch. So make sure you're doing what you want to be doing.
Yeah, make it count, right?
Yeah.
I was gonna say, you talk about existentialism and like, hey, one thing is certain, and that's death. And I think that there's a lot of powerful ideology and thought process that comes from that, like Stoic philosophy. And then there's the not so good, right? Like where it becomes a nihilistic view. It's like, well, we're all gonna die. Like, what's the point?
Right.
So yeah, and that's everything we're talking about is like the value of making your time count and doing with the life you have what you can to fulfill your purpose. And your purpose should be very different than mine. It should be very different than Luke's.
Yeah, we get to create the meanings, kind of how you use the word reframe, how I like to reframe that. If everything's meaningless, then cool, that's on me. I get to make what I want this thing to mean. And so each person gets to take on the responsibility of, okay, what do I want my life to mean? And how can I be the hero? And that isn't always, I'm never going to be as badass as you getting blown up at like being in gunfights.
No,
That's
hey,
not my life.
you don't know. You
That
don't
is
know.
not, I live a very boring desk job type of life, but I write about heroes like you. But the point is, I can be a hero just making dinner for the family, and like you can show up that way. Like everybody can be a hero in even the most mundane looking of circumstances. I write about these big heroic events, but the themes and the lessons and the takeaways are for everybody. Like living a small, quiet life is just as meaningful and fulfilling. You mentioned that earlier. You don't have to be the most famous, grand figure out there. You just don't.
Yeah. And I like the notion of the hero's journey. I love it actually. And at the same time, like a lot of first responders cringe at being identified as a hero. And I also recognize like sometimes it's not for you, sometimes it's for the people looking. But I think also when we say that, like I'm trying not to push back, and I receive and I appreciate the compliment because I think so much of truly, like I said earlier, like the one thing I knew for my life I wanted to be was a dad. So, and I know that so many people's personal heroes are their parents, and I'm like, yes, like that's the stuff. So, I have a close friend that has shared years ago that he kind of wanted to do more. He grew up watching like military movies and war stories and westerns with his grandpa, and he sees me becoming a cop. He's like, man, I'm just like working this job, and I'm like, no, you're not. You're like you are a very positive influence to all of our friends. You're a positive kind of linchpin in your family, like a greater extended family that you're bringing. Like, I know that he has helped navigate a lot of family drama, and he's like that guy. He's that guy that keeps them together. He's that guy that furthers the legacy of his grandparents and traditions. He's now, a dad and a family man, and he's a manager. He's a boss, right? And like to be a boss is literally a huge impact, or to be a good boss is like that affects people's livelihood and it affects their mental state. Like you spend so much time at work, if you're supportive and you help people get what they need for their families and themselves and fulfillment, like that is service, right? And so he contributes, right? He's a he cares about philanthropies, he donates. So it's like all these things. I'm like, dude, that's not to sound cheesy, but like you are doing the thing that people need to be doing. Like that is enough. That's more than enough. It's great. And so not everyone should be, carrying a fire hose or, going overseas. But, everyone has their place, and that's should only really be determined by them.
Yeah, don't discount your position and how important you are, how big your role is, how many people you impact. It's far beyond your scope and like what people realize. I think like people are watching you, whether you realize it or not. You have an influence over people, and that's also an important responsibility,
Yeah.
no matter what
Outside
you
of
do.
Rocky, what are some of your favorite stories or movies?
I've always really liked Good Will Hunting. I think when we look at like career path, how I ended up a counselor, it was probably that because
Hmm.
that whole story is about a guy who has ungodly potential, and he was just sitting on it. Like Ben Affleck puts it in, you're sitting on a winning lottery ticket. You're too much of a pussy to cash it in, and I
Mm.
think that just like really resonated with me um, for how I generalize a lot of people's feeling of meaninglessness. It's you feel that call to adventure, that's that potential, and you're just sitting there. You're just not taking it on. And so that story, I think, really exemplifies that and why having good friends. I mean, that movie shows you what a good group of friends can do for you. They buy him a car and stuff at the end, let him be able to chase after the girl.
Yeah.
Having a good um, older role model, a good male figure in Robin Williams' character, and having a good pursuit, a career pursuit. So that is shown in the other male professor, and how all of these things I think are good lessons for young men who feel like I need some sense of direction, some purpose. And I think it shows it all. It shows love interest. It shows friendship. It shows male role models, like a father figure. It shows a career trajectory and having a discipline to move forward in a career. I love that movie.
Yeah. It's such a good one. And Robin Williams is he is that archetype, right? He is that
Hmm.
that figure in so many. He's either the protagonist or he's that like kind of spirit guide, right? Into the unknown, and he's Gandalf.
Right.
He's Aslan, right?
Yeah. So good. Yeah. Good Will Hunting is one. I'm trying to think of some other like I've always really liked. Have you ever seen Warrior with like Tom Hardy,
Yeah,
Joel Edgerton?
yeah.
I really like
That was
that one.
good. That was really good.
Um, yeah, like a good family drama.
Good family
Yeah.
drama with a lot of punching and
Oh
decent
yeah.
amount of blood. Yeah.
Yeah. Good family
That's
drama
the
that
fighter in you. Yeah.
keeps the fighting. Yeah, that keeps the combat sports. There's only a few good combat sports movies, so I'm gonna always bring them up. I'll even accept Never Back Down, even though people hate that movie.
Mm. Mhm.
I've got so many in my brain that it kind of like makes me paralysis analysis trying to think of
Yeah.
what movies to show. If you tell me what is your favorite movie, I will give you a similar film. I'll put
Mm.
it that way. Let's do that. Do you have a favorite movie?
My favorite one. I mentioned Saving Private Ryan earlier. One of my favorites is Big Fish.
Oh yeah, that's
Yeah, it's
Tim Burton, right?
yeah, and Ian McGregor. But for that one, and there was a period in my early adulthood when I was reflecting on what my favorite movies were and why,
Hmm.
and we talked about Saving Private Ryan and Big Fish. Like the theme was like fatherhood and kind of storytelling, right? That the whole thing was a reframe. The spoiler alert, but this movie is like 25 years old, so like if you get mad, like get out of here. But the son is at his father's essentially deathbed, and he's so resentful of these tall tales that his dad told. But his dad had all these friends and admirers because he was such a positive guy that lived life so brightly. And the son has to come to this contention point where he recognizes how much love there was. He just doesn't see things the same way. But for me, like that's another thing. But just I just wanted a good relationship with my dad, right? And that's where I was seeking a lot of male figure role models, and that's why I like talking about it, right? I think that is one of the most critical social ills, is that dads aren't stepping up. And moms, like, thank you, moms and aunts and aunties and grandmas, and it's not the same. It's just
Right.
not to make it a gender thing. It's just not the same, and so we need people to step up. We need dads to step up. But then also, so much of why I probably didn't turn out a bad way was because I had friends, dads and friends' parents that were really taking me in and looking after the other angles and the other kind of perspectives that, my mom, like, bless her, like how hard she was working and like the long hours being a latchkey kid, like that's kind of a recipe for things to happen. But it didn't, because I had really positive influences around me and people that really cared about me.
Right. Yeah, the father effect is massive. There's a lot of books about that. Like the father effect is one of the books. Yeah, it's just not the same as you mentioned, and research is showing that like men specifically, like boys, need men in their lives. And ideally, that would be the father. But then if uncles can step up, or baseball coach, football coach, like as long as there's a male role model in there to show that ideal, that same thing, like just giving them something to look ahead at, um, and kind of a model to be able to build themselves off of. That matters so much to people. When we go back to the switch from me being depressed to being able to look forward, it was that idea of like, okay, what kind of man do I want to be? Identifying these archetypes in individual I've seen in my life, or stories, and kind of building towards that. And going back to Rocky, where you see him, one of the coolest things I think that people can take away from that is if you look at all the films up to the sixth one, there's a character in his head, a father figure in his head, giving him a pep talk while he's down and trying to like get back up in one of the last fights. And in the sixth film, it's his own voice giving himself a pep talk, because ultimately, like, we're gonna have to cut ties with that, and we're
Mm,
gonna have to be our own men and step up. So it's finding these role models, building this internal steersman, as I like to call it, within yourself that can guide you like a father would once it's time to step away from home and be your own man. And to wrap that up with a movie recommendation based on what you said, King Arthur and the Legend of the Sword, I think depicts this really well. You can listen to the writer of that film on Joe Rogan talking about this too. He breaks down the analogies and the metaphors and what it means in the hero's journey to kind of represent the power of the father, and how important it is for men to take up that sword and take on the responsibility, and how that can make all the difference. So,
yeah. Was that the Guy Ritchie one?
yep, that was the
Okay.
guy right
Yeah, yeah. Man, what you said, I kind of got chills when you're breaking down the Rocky anthology of yeah, I didn't recognize that, so I'm gonna have to nerd out and watch that sometime soon. But yeah, like it that resonates with me, right? Because I'm in my late 30s and I've received the gifts of mentorship of a lot of people that looking out, or a lot of people that hit up that were very gracious to share their experiences and their wisdom. I like this notion of finding your mentors, you maybe ones that you haven't met, right? Living or dead, right? Examples in history, or these resources for thought and development. And so you can glean all these examples, but you have to be your own person. And I feel like I'm in that chapter where years prior, it was so much of like, oh, what would so and so do in this situation? And like that was really helpful, right? Because I respect the crud out of some of these people and leaders. And ultimately it's blending this all together, as we say in police, like you get so many field trainers and you got to figure out how to be your own cop. Yeah, and that continues on, and you see your peers and you see your supervisors, and you keep taking on these things to make, your most fleshed out tool belt. But I do feel like I'm in that phase where now it's more of like, oh, what do I want to do? And with all those inputs, creating my themes and my, I suppose, my direction, like what am I going to do in this situation, and trusting in that, right? Betting on yourself and believing in yourself. I think that's so huge. And so I love how you unpack that and where the applications could be for people.
yeah, giving yourself more credit is a big thing. I see this a lot with writers, but I'm sure it happens across the board with just individuals. Is that we get so down on ourselves and question our abilities so much that we hold ourselves back, and we won't take a step forward in fear of making the wrong step, like miscalculating. But if you just give yourself more credit, and the way you would encourage a friend, encourage yourself, because you know your friend's going to make mistakes, and it's not going to be perfect for them, but you're fine to tell them, yeah, you should do it, because you're a smart individual, you'll figure it out. But you won't say that same thing to yourself, and you won't give yourself that same amount of credit. So cutting yourself that same grace, and moving forward, I think is a big thing. Yeah, it's not going to be perfect, but just please give yourself credit and move forward.
Yeah, and it reminds me of what you said earlier, right? Like we tell ourselves these lies, and to flip it, I've talked on this or thought about this, where what I want to talk about is negative self-talk, right?
Hmm.
And what we tell ourselves, oh, you're not good enough, or that's a dumb idea, and people are going to laugh, or people are going to judge. Well, flip it into, if this was your friend's idea, what would you say? And a lot of times you're like, it's a great idea, and I would say
Yeah.
like, yeah, go crush it, like. And if they were saying that to themselves, you'd say, snap out of that. Don't talk to yourself like that. Like,
Hmm.
how dare you talk to yourself like that? You're a fantastic person, right? Like,
Right.
but then you do it to yourself. We do it to ourselves all the time. And, really close friend, I had a good conversation with him yesterday, and he sent this video to me, and it was like one of those like where it was really inspirational. So for a little bit, I was like, is this going to like totally like 180? And
Yeah.
like, but it was like, think about a friend that it was essentially like with this, instrumental music, and, this friend that is out there and grinding and crushing it and not giving himself enough credit. And I was like, oh man, he's going to say like, you're a big idiot or something like that. But no, it was a really kind video that he sent me. He's like, tag your friend or send this to him if he's that guy. And I'm like, dude, I was really expecting like a little like a
Yeah.
jab, but thank you so much. And yeah, it was very kind. But yeah, I love what you said, man.
Yeah. Sincerity can go a long way, and it's something that it can be tough, especially amongst men. Like to just genuinely give a nice compliment, it could be a little tough, right? It could be a little awkward, and it always feels like I have to throw a joke in to cut the
Mm,
tension. But
yeah.
yeah, being genuine and just letting people know when they're doing a good job, that's always that goes a long way.
Yeah. Are you familiar with the show Welcome to Wrexham?
Yeah.
It's like
No, I'll
so
look
it's
it up.
a documentary series. Basically, Ryan Reynolds and Rob McElhenney from Always Sunny, which you're
Yeah.
probably familiar with.
Right.
They became the majority stakeholders of a Welsh soccer team, and so it's on FX. But essentially, watching that, there was one episode where the show writer specifically highlighted this notion of like male relationships, because it's a soccer team, and they were kind of breaking down some parts of it where they said, how male relationships and friendships are not the same as females. And for one huge indicator is that you call it a bromance. And for women, you call it friendship. And so there's literally like this different dynamic where bromances become a point of humor, right? Bro
Hmm.
hugs. All right, let's hug it out, bro. And you get really loud about it. And like, I love that that's happening. I love, my bromances. I love my male friendships, and that we have a culture, at my work and with my other friends where we can hug and like, high five and joke and just be comfortable with each other. However, it was an interesting twist because I hadn't ever heard this where, hey, you have to make this big show of it and call it something because it's not okay, and because you don't want to be judged, and because society you perceive as judging if you don't label it with, hey, let's hug it out, bro.
Yeah.
So I think that's an interesting layer to consider of like, yeah, it's probably evidence that we need to continue it and maybe do more of it, right? Be open, be vulnerable, be supportive of each other.
Yeah. I love that. Yeah. I wish there was more straight sincerity, things just as they were meant to be said, where could happen in male friendships without the cutting with humor. That's the big. I mean, I'm a culprit of this. I've with my closest male friends, like a dude I've known since third grade. If I'm gonna get real serious, has to be a joke within the next 30 seconds because I'm still a little uncomfortable. Like
Mm,
that is that is something that's still there. It's something that we can work on as a culture. And the idea I like that I don't know if you've heard this one before is the comprehensive man. I think that's something to look into. It's
mm,
the fact that comprehensive men should be just as much the warrior and the guy who can carry the gun and can carry his son out of a burning building. Like, yeah, all this stuff that you think like um, stereotypically masculine, like all that hard stuff. Yeah, cool. But also on the other end, you need to be able to be compassionate. You need to be able to sit there and let your wife kind of talk, as we said earlier, and try to hear her and receive her, and be able to watch the princess films with your daughter. Like you need to be able to do the spectrum, and women can do that so easy. They can switch from protective, fierce to
mm-hmm.
soft and loving. But guys have like we still have a problem switching back and forth. We like either want to be the hyper masculine guy, or else we or we're gonna cry and try to hide that fact. Like we're still a little awkward about some of the softer sides of masculinity, but the comprehensive man is kind of where I'm uh, aiming towards. And to throw a novel recommendation at people, Taylor Moore's Downrange, his Garrett Cole series, fantastic kind of representation of that. It's this: um, he's a DEA agent, and he lives in Texas, and you see him adopt a son, and it's just like through that relationship, you see what a comprehensive man looks like. I think he does a really good job of showing that in a fictional form.
Mm. That's really cool. Yeah, it makes me what you were saying makes me think of like the four male archetypes of like king, magician, warrior, lover. And yeah, it is a balance, and those things can become out of whack in different people, and probably all of us, right? And so it's just an awareness of how we can balance those energies. When you introduce, I hadn't heard that concept of comprehensive man. It makes me think about how if we want to generate comprehensive men, it it takes the right role models to show it's okay. And what I
Mhm.
mean by that is, it helped me be a supervisor, a sergeant, a leader, publicly saying, "Hey, yeah, we need to do this more and beat the drum for mental health," because I saw a seasoned, really empathetic, but like a really big, like buff older sergeant do that from
Yeah.
another agency where like I was like, okay, like I wouldn't call him weak, and no one
Right.
in the room's gonna call him
Yeah.
weak. Like he's tangled with people and he could bench press like 8 of us. So if he's saying that he, gets emotional and he'll like watch a movie with his family and cry and hug
Mhm.
them all, and then he's gonna do a debrief with us and then hug us all, like that's toughness, right? But
Yeah.
for me, it kind of takes that, right? And I think that that is just an awareness. I'm not saying that's good. I'm saying it's an awareness that we have these masculine perceptions and energies that that we're contending with, and like what's okay, and to socialize that. And if it is a thing that makes it more societally okay, then maybe we do use that as a mechanism to introduce the medicine, if that makes sense.
Right. I mean, you said it. It's we build the culture every day. So you start to do that. You start to be that. You start to show that and be that man, and it's gonna spread. And it'll give someone else the permission to do that. It'll give someone else the permission to do that. And you can back to what we said about influencing those around you. You're going to make kind of your general area, your culture that you have an impact over. You're going to turn the tide on that. You can
Yeah.
definitely do that.
Yeah, and I wanted to ask you about fiction, and I'll introduce like historical figures, but all these conversations that we've had for the last hour plus, one person that sticks out in this, and especially like the things that you write about and the things you talk about, I'm thinking about Teddy Roosevelt, and
Yeah,
you're nodding,
he's
yeah, and
great.
so yeah, because most people that know just a little bit about him, they know the Rough Riders, they know he was a soldier, he was out there, and he was like doing the cowboy thing. They probably know that he took a bullet during a speech and
Mhm.
finished the speech, but what they might not know is that he was a sickly boy, and he like just mind over mattered his way to health and being this robust wrestler and fighter, boxer, right, and this woodsman and hunter. And he basically, if I remember right, this book kind of broke down how he basically like fought the asthma out of his body by just like running and
Yeah,
like training his body, like, and he's in this giant library, this basically like an aristocrat, and just like sprinting and like doing push-ups and doing all these things and just like willing it. um and they also probably don't know that he wrote these like super sensitive like love letters to his wife, and I'm just like, okay, these are the things we should highlight. It was like, yeah, who's going to say that guy wasn't a badass and what he was able to accomplish to presidency and everything in between? But then also, like, he was he, you might say he was a gentle soul. He was a sensitive guy, and he was constantly writing and reflecting and journaling and just multifaceted, right? Comprehensive man. And so that pops into my mind as you describe that.
yeah. Teddy Roosevelt is a character that if you haven't looked into or haven't read a book or two on, check him out. I mean, he's going to be inspirational to you. He's always been inspirational to me because of that health thing and him growing up sickly. I've always resonated with that, and I found it very fascinating too that he wasn't, with the health thing and just personality wise, he wasn't born into being that tough cowboy figure. And he purposefully chose to put himself there. And he called it being a field scientist, meaning he
Mm,
was going to kind of like go out there and live with these guys to learn how to be that way and like learn how to build up grit and endurance. And it shows that these things aren't just always inborn. Yes, I have them. I'm ready to go. They're muscles that can be trained up just like you train in the gym. You can build your endurance. You can build your grit. You can build your discipline. You can build all these things if you're willing to go out there and experience, that hardship and do that purposefully.
I think that's what it's all about. I mean, that's what my stance is, right? Trying to help people recognize like their grit and their adversity and ability to overcome that and get better and more resilient. healthy, like everything intertwined. So I appreciate everything we talked about, and I want to talk a little bit more just about your writing. I read a chapter that you posted online, and I love that, that instantly, you're in a warplane and you have the character is trying to, basically fight his way out of this really sticky situation. But yeah, tell us a little bit about your writing, the books you've written, and your projects, and where people can find you.
What you read on narrative, it's narrative-compass.com. You can read. I'm putting out a chapter at a time of a free story, free men's adventure fiction kind of narrative, throwing back to the old classic heroes. Think, Indiana Jones and kind of a Teddy Roosevelt figure. It's just a really tough guy on a fun adventure. It's just meant there to give you a nice read week by week and give you something fun to look forward to. The novels I've written are Frozen Wrath and Retaliation Mountain are both out. They're stories set in Montana. It starts with a missing kid and a manhunt through snowy wilderness, and it kind of opens up into more of a nefarious plot. And that's a story about an older man, like 60 years old, kind of deciding who he's going to be and how he's going to leave his legacy. That was an important message for me to get out there. The first words in the novel are, "This is where you decide who you are," and he kind of has this journey to pick, in his final days, what is he going to do? What legacy is he going to leave? And you see the impact of his life in Retaliation Mountain when a young cop, O'Brien, kind of picks up the mantle where he left off and kind of tries to help shape the culture of his town back where it needs to be, because it's a town where things are starting to decay because those ideals have fallen away. And it's about the men trying to build it back up. And my newest novel is Vipers. It comes out, Vipers and Red Rocks. It's not coming out until April, but you can find me on Instagram at LSAuthor to get updates there. And check out the free story at narrative-compass.
Yeah, and that information will be in the show notes. Where can they find your books?
You can get them on Amazon. Yeah, check them out there. Or narrative-compass.com. You can get them on there as well.
Fantastic. Yeah, you describe the one with the cops, and like I got chills. Say that opening line again.
This is where you decide who you are. It's something his brother says to him in like a big decision point moment, and that moment kind of haunts him. And it's about how like these narratives get stuck inside of us of like, this is who you are. And it's like, really, this decision you made when you were a young man, this is what defines you. And it's him coming to terms with like, well, I think I can redefine myself. I think I can take actions and steps to change who I am. You're not who I say I am, type of thing. And so it's kind of about he's an ex-motorcycle gang member trying to right his wrongs and kind of patch things up before he heads out because he's on his last leg.
I love that, man. When you said that opening line, and I thought about how we say that to ourselves, or we can say that to ourselves, like, this is who you are. And what I think about there is your actions, like what you do now, this is who you are. What you do today, how you talk to people, how you carry out your vision, like this is who you are, and this is the impact you make. And I'm gonna get that book, man. I'm gonna read that because
I'll send you a copy. Just hit me up on Instagram. You don't have to buy it. I'm gonna send it to you.
oh man, thanks. But no, if that doesn't resonate, that description doesn't resonate with everyone that's trying to do this job right now, with that sense of decay and like, hey, like we're gonna right some wrongs and we're gonna do the best damn job we can with what we have and the people we have to our left and our right, and it'll be worth it, because we're gonna put our effort into it. I think that's huge, right? There's a direct correlation to my profession there for sure, and the times that we're looking at. So, Luke, this has been a fantastic conversation. I knew it would be. Just sometimes you just pick up a little bit of what someone's about, and what you put out. And I was so humbled and also so appreciative of the vastness of what you can contribute and what you've contributed to me and the listeners, I'm sure. So I appreciate it, and I've loved this conversation. And we, as a society, as men and women, need to just have more conversations like this. So I very much appreciate all your time and sharing that with us today.
Yeah, thank you. It's been an honor. I really appreciate you having me on, and what you're doing here is fantastic. You're going to be that mentor to another kid listening. I know podcasts were absolutely huge for me in finding mentors. So this is great what you're doing. I appreciate being a part of it. I'm honored.
Thanks so much, man.
Take care.
Thank you for tuning into another episode of Blue Grit Radio. As always, support this community by subscribing, giving us a 5-star review, and following, liking, and sharing posts on Blue Grit Wellness on Instagram. You can reach me there or email me at bluegritwellness@gmail.com. Be well and stay gritty.